Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this discussion on data localization. Now, very briefly, data localization is about imposing some kind of restriction on the cross-border transfer or flow of data. And there have been many arguments made about why it's necessary in certain contexts. And in India, we've had our own set of discussions and debates about what motivates this and is to impose localization requirements. So I want to start with Rahul and ask him, what do you make of this change? What do you read in the bill about the government's approach? Because it's also a little ambiguous. And especially, how is it different from the previous versions?
To my reading, the bill completely reverses the idea that was started by the Justice Sri Krishna draft around localization. And I say this because if you look at the evolution of the law since the first draft to its current stage, we've seen a steady whittling away of the localization imperative that started in the Justice Sri Krishna draft. That was a localization of personal data. The next draft had a localization only of sensitive personal data. And this draft actually doesn't even use the word localization. It says that transfers will be permitted to certain named countries that are presented in the schedule. And if I look at the trend, I would say that this is we've reached a position where virtually there is no localization, that the government is now going to move to an approach where it is going to identify certain countries to whom data may not be allowed to be transferred. And we're still to see that list of countries. But it's not an obligation to keep data here. It is more an obligation not to share data with certain named countries. And I think there is still a lot to unpack because there is a provision in terms of what conditions there are that may be prescribed with regard to which countries will be on the list or not. And so that's a level of detail that we need to unpack. But I think it would be remiss on our part as the panel to ignore what has happened since the Justice Sri Krishna draft, which is the moment the draft law was made public, the Reserve Bank of India introduced a payment localization obligation. We've seen similar sectoral localization obligations coming up in various other sectors. And so I think the question that we will perhaps need to continue to ask ourselves, despite what this draft says, and if this draft does get enacted, what the law says, is that sectoral restrictions on where data can be kept may still be a factor that we have to contend with.
Before I move on, I just wanted you to quickly give a sense to the audience about what is at stake when you impose localization requirements. How does it affect the business model of a company like Meta, but also any startup, any small business that's basically storing data abroad or sending it abroad for analytics and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all kind of inherently understand in our daily lives as consumers that we are interacting with businesses around the world and using services kind of globally, and in our daily lives of kind of making travel reservations or buying things from companies overseas. We are engaging in kind of the global economy. And I think we understand that on a very intuitive level. And so what is at stake here is the ability to be able to continue to do that in a seamless and as frictionless a way as we currently do. So very specifically, for companies to have to kind of store data locally, not only is it a huge kind of cost, which is a much harder hurdle for smaller companies. There are real technological challenges in terms of being able to provide seamless, real-time services in a consistent way globally. You run into challenges of kind of latency and copies, and real friction is added to the system if it's even able to still operate globally, depending on kind of the extent of localization and local storage that we're talking about.
Right. In some sense, it's the idea of sovereignty hitting up against the idea of business efficiencies, and we're just trying to figure out a good way to resolve that.
Yeah, I mean, just on the sovereignty point, I mean, I think that there's I think everyone agrees that there is a lot of value to be extracted from data, and particularly value for public interest and public policy making purposes. I mentioned earlier that the prior draft included this concept of non-personal data with the idea that value can be harnessed from that data. And I absolutely agree. And I think that there are privacy protective ways to take and leverage data in different ways for public interest purposes. But data does not need to be stored locally to achieve those goals. And so I think, I still do welcome a conversation maybe outside now, I guess, the scope of the bill around how to leverage personal data and non-personal data for those public goods purposes. But that's a different conversation.